Everyone will just start in a moment. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for this edition of Never Too Late. And I'm Kristen Motti, one of the adult programs librarians at the Central Library of the Boston Public Library. So welcome and thank you for joining us. Before introducing our presenter for today's program, I do just want to remind you that your camera and your microphone are on, they're both on mute. And if you do have any questions for our guest author today, go ahead and type them in the Q&A box on the bottom, and we will have time for questions sort of midway toward the end of the program. Without further ado, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our guest author today. Carmela Cattuti is a teacher. She had set out on an academic career, but decided to write fiction instead. Between the Cracks and the Ascent are based on her great journey from Sicily and subsequent life in America and her influence on 3 generations thereafter of Americans. Carmela is currently writing a 3rd novel in this series. Welcome, Carmela.
Thank you so much, and thanks for everyone who attends today. And it's going to be just a brief kind of PowerPoint, just to give everybody an overview and a bit about the novels in general. They're based on my great aunt's story. Of course, they're embellished because they are fiction, but her experience is unique, certainly to the 20th century and unique to immigration stories. So she experienced the 1908 earthquake in Sicily, which wiped out Messina. She was a resident of Messina, as was her family. And she was left an orphan. Actually, her parents had died prior to that, but she had a brother and a sister and an aunt and a grandmother. But her sister and her aunt and grandmother were killed in the earthquake. However, her sister's body was never found. So that always haunted her for her entire life. So her brother survived, but died soon after they found him. So that was her beginning, and that influenced the rest of her life. So it was major, and it was dramatic, and it was connected to the earth. So she's a very earthy person in general. So I'm just going to do an overview of the situation in Messina prior to the earthquake, which Angela had experienced. So this is a little background about her experience, and she's the protagonist of The Ascent and Between the Cracks, and she is also the protagonist of the third novel. So her influence stretched way into the 20th century and probably continues today with her relatives, certainly with me. So a little bit, let's see here, about myself. I'm the great niece of the main character, and I knew many of the minor characters that I've portrayed in both novels. I knew them, I was influenced by them. So I knew their language and I knew how they spoke Sicilian and how they spoke English as well. And my great aunt always stressed that I was to write her story because she was very proud, actually, of how she got to America. I mean, I think her experience of America when she got here was very different than what she had expected. I think she expected a happier life, but we'll get into that in a little bit. And I went to Boston College, so I'm a Boston College girl in literature, graduate school. So why she had such an impact on me. So we lived in the same house, and we lived in an extended family situation. And her presence was kind of looming. She was a looming figure. She was creative, she was spiritual, she was cultural, she was feminine, she developed her intuition, and she was kind and she was generous. So she had a lot of amazing qualities that she had developed over the years after experiencing great hardship, because she ended up in a convent as an orphan. And you got the sense that her life was a great epic and you wanted to be a part of it. So everyone she met, she was viewed as exotic with unusual circumstances, unusual experiences that propelled her into developing her intuition and passing that on. And she also, when she got to America, wanted her family to be successful, especially in this new country. And that's a major theme throughout all the books, and how she impressed that on people. Even though she was not successful in some ways, she was very successful with actually this third generation that she influenced, which was my generation. Okay, let's move on. I don't want to bore you with PowerPoint stuff. And this is Sicily, and it's at the boot. And on the right is an image of Messina when they built it. So we'll talk about what happened to Messina after the earthquake, because they had to completely rebuild it. And why is it important to our Italian culture? Why she was. And I think she was important, any immigrant who experienced major changes in her country. So Angela was not your typical immigrant. She wasn't the Godfather story, which is what is typically thought when you think of an Italian immigrant. We've all seen the PBS documentaries about Southern Italian immigration. She would never connect with those kind of stories. In a sense, she was a kind of outsider in her community, in the Italian American community, because they didn't have her experience. She would never have immigrated had she not lost her family. She just wouldn't have. So if people immigrated because they were poor and came to this country to work, but they really intended to return to Sicily. Angela's story was different. Many came with they were unskilled laborers. She came with a skill. So she was a master designer. She was a clothing designer, a seamstress. And she developed that actually in the convent. They taught the girls to sew. She could sew prior to that, but she really stood out from the other girls who were sewing at the time. And also the convent, and we'll get into this, was an orphanage, but it was also a school for moneyed people. And she ended up in Palermo, actually. And at Palazzo Butera, which is a palazzo owned by the Prince and Princess of Palermo. And they gave a building to the nuns to house orphans and develop a school. So how did I come to write this book? Well, once I completed my master's, I asked myself what was next. And I thought, well, I'll teach journal writing at the Adult Education Institution in Cambridge, which I did. And I wrote for the Somerville News. And after a while, I just didn't like the journalism culture and the type of writing that I was doing. So I knew at that point I would write Angela's stories. She always wanted me to do that anyway. And it was kind of her gift to me. The 1980s was a difficult time to get published. So I finished the novels in '87, the first one, Between the Cracks. But it was just hard to get a publisher. I had one in London and it fell through. The economy was not doing well. So I thought, well, I'm putting it away and that's it. But I picked it up again in the 21st century and I rewrote it for the 21st century. So it has gone through many incarnations. And I connected with a friend who had published, and the rest is history. I connected with her publisher. So, and then I started to see how much her influence extended into several decades. Let's move on. So she was my nanny. We lived with her. My father had died when I was 7, and she and my uncle, we had a huge Queen Anne Victorian, and I have some photos of that outside of New York City, and we lived there. So she took care of all of us, and she told me every single bit of her story, her entire story. But, you know, there were things that were left out that I was curious about as well. You know, she was very verbal. She was passionate about her story as high drama. We live in a culture that really frowns upon passion, especially back then. But Italians have great passion, but Angela's passion was just not about expressing her truth, but expressing it in a creative and elegant way. So creativity becomes very important. It's very important in the novels and how you express that. She painted a multi-layer picture with words and just with her presence. So it's a key element in the book, seeing her life as high drama, and she was fearless in expressing that. Even though no one shared her experience, she kept talking about it. And that's what was interesting, because it kind of rang hollow sometimes because people couldn't imagine that, you know, experience that level of earthquake and change in one's life in a day, really. So let's move on. She was highly cultural in a creative sense. She was expansive. She had developed that kind of expansive way about her because she connected with people outside of the Italian-American community. So that was key. Most people became very insular during the 20th century, especially upon immigration, but not her, because she found that she could reach out through her creativity, through her sewing, and she started to gather up clients. When she first came to the US, she did not sew in a factory. She sewed at a convent, actually, outside of New York City, St. Mary's Convent and School. And that's how she started. She couldn't even speak English when she got that job. My great uncle actually worked for the nuns, and he was a plumber, electrician, architect. He did everything. So that's how she started, meeting people and learning in English. So she was creative, and just creative with people and how to deal with people. She knew how to do that. She had faced some dire circumstances as a 10-year-old. She's about 10 years old during the earthquake. So she's met some fairly seedy people after the earthquake. And, you know, she would never say that. If you read accounts of what happened after the earthquake with people, especially with children, she was very creative in how she dealt with that. And there were a lot of missing pieces. There was a mystery to her story, who her parents were, what happened to her sister, and her connection to the Princess of Trabia, the municipality in the province of Palermo. She had a connection with Giulia, and that was the princess at the time when she moved to Palazzo Butera. The princess took a special shining to her, and it was always a mystery why that happened. So we'll get into that. She had a unique approach to spirituality. She worshiped Mary, the Blessed Mother. There were reasons for that, but she was a big proponent of the sacred feminine. She attended church, but that was more or less so that people would not talk. Her community would not talk and say bad things. You had to show up, regardless of what you thought. Okay, early 20th century Sicily. So I just want to talk a little bit about the background here. So our character was born in 1894, to give you a sense. The earthquake happened in 1908. So the political climate, and we all know that Sicily was conquered and conquered and conquered by the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Normans, the Muslims, the Spanish, the Bourbons, you name it. So it is a multi-dimensional society, at least it was back then. The unification of Italy happened in 1860, so not long before my great aunt was born in 1894. It was just happened like 20 years or 30 years prior to her birth. The new constitution that was favored, it favored the North. It always favored the North. It favored the North in tax policies and military interference. There was a revolt in Palermo in 1894, the year of her birth. and the city was bombed by the North. And the police force was very strict and violent. So that was the climate she was born into. And then, of course, there's religious issues. The Sicilians in particular were tongue-in-cheek about Roman Catholicism. They had more of a folk religion that had little to do with formal dogmas or rituals. They had their own rituals, which was connected to the earth, and a kind of a different bent on spirituality. So it's no surprise that Angela developed hers quite easily. Unlike the Irish Catholics who respected priests, Italians were more suspicious of the church. And many supported the aristocracy who kept them down. So the church supported the aristocracy. And that was a big issue, of course, with most Sicilians. Cultural mores. Well, the unrest, the upper classes had a lot of disdain for common folk, and it was prevalent. They had an economic investment in keeping the poor poor. A lot of class issues. There was a lot of poverty, social unrest, and rebellion of the lower classes. And of course, there was military intervention there. Women, it was not a safe place for women. You couldn't take paid work. Their activities were confined to the home, and there were strict limits in their public behavior, including their access to education, which is really important, and outside influences. So my aunt valued education, because when she went to live with the nuns in Palermo, they educated the children. They educated the girls, because it was a girls' convent. Formal rituals of courting were chaperoned, and arranged marriages were happening. Strictly governed relations between the sexes. So it was very strict. Protection of female chastity was also critical to maintaining family honor. So those were the mores, and that's what she was born into. And the social climate, just wanted to mention that. I mean, it's in the prologue of the first book. Social climate was one of suspicion of one's neighbor. And that was very true. Let's move on. So the earthquake happened December 28th, 5:20 a.m. So people were sleeping. They were in their beds, and that's why it was such a disaster. The earthquake was followed by a tsunami, which killed people as well. There were tons of aftershocks. So buildings just fell on survivors. Messina was a population, I mean, this varies, the numbers vary depending on how you're researching. Generally, a population of 150,000 in Messina, hundreds were left. So it wiped out a lot of the population there. So Americans came and they did the best they could. Help was slow to come. I mean, this is 1908. But Americans came in ships. And there is a visual of what happened. So you see, it was really, really devastating. And, there must have been, I've read accounts of a lot of abuse, certainly a lot of abuse of the elderly and children. So people turn a little bit evil when disasters like this happen. So a new home in a convent. Let's see. I'm sorry, St. Vincent de Paul. It was a French order of nuns. So that the nuns spoke French, they spoke Italian. Sicilian was not a language that they would allow people to speak. So all the girls had to learn Italian. So my aunt actually spoke Italian and Sicilian. And at that time, it was a very different language. Not as much today, but during the early 20th century, definitely. So French and Italian, and I'm sure some spoke English, actually. But she got an education and developed her talents. She was a popular girl and connected with many different people. So the girls that came from homes to go to school, she connected with them as well as the other orphans. Okay, Princess Julia of Palermo, and this is the woman that took care of my great aunt, bought her linens when she was designing them, and let her use one of the buildings when she got married, because my uncle came from America to marry. And he was 12 years old, my great uncle, when he came to the US, but he went back, maybe he's 21, 22, to find a wife. And his cousin told him to go to the convent in Palermo and pick one out. So he picked my aunt, and that's how that happened, you know? So she was Angela was Julia's favorite, which was kind of unusual. And this is Pietro Lonzo di Trabia. And my aunt's last name was Lonzo. So there was a connection there. And I didn't find the specific connection. I dealt with it differently in the Ascent, their connection, but it's still a mystery. Why she ended up in Palermo and why the princess favored her and took care of her. Okay. And here's a telegram from Julia to Angela expressing her disappointment at not being able to attend her wedding because she paid for the whole thing. So there it is. And that was the princess's telegram. And she's just saying, I'm sorry I couldn't be there. And I wish you luck with your new husband. So I'm really glad that I had saved that, because that's kind of a piece of evidence there, you know. And this was our home. So this was the Queen Anne Victoria, and this is where Angela ended up. Bought the house in the 1930s. They ended up, when they came to New York, they ended up in Manhattan with, my uncle's mother was still living there, and they were living in a tenement, I expect. And then shortly after that, they moved out of New York City, 40 miles north. And my uncle had actually bought up houses, which my aunt did not know about. So he was really ambitious. And they both were. They both were creative, ambitious, and they were always helping people. So, and this is St. Mary's School, and that's where she ended up when she first came to, oh dear. I didn't mean to go there. Oh dear. Sorry about that. Anyway, that's okay. So St. Mary Angela's in the 1980s, I can do that. I can bring that up. Bring that up here. Kind of a fun picture. Let's see here. Okay, so I want to go to this slide. And this is the 1930s, and this is the kind of things that she would sew, and she would make gowns like that. So she was very popular dressmaker. She built her clientele over the years. She sewed for many of the wealthy women in the area, many of the Jewish women, some Italians, but she reached out beyond her community, and that's how she did it. And this is the council shop, which was open in 1941, the Jewish Women's League. And she had many clients who were, one in particular, collected to the Jewish League. And they had many conversations about World War II when that was going on. And that's in the book as well. And you'll get a different point of view of what was happening during the war. And Grand Central. So this plays a very important part in the second book, and how her great nieces and nephews, migrated there back to Manhattan. So she raised my uncle's sister, who was 10 years old when she first came to America. She had children. She helped raise her children. And then she helped raise myself and my brothers and sister. So she helped raise 3 generations. She didn't have children of her own. And that is her during the 1980s. She passed away in 1988. She was 93 in that picture. Always looked good. And in conclusion, I think her story is unique in that it just doesn't end with her. It doesn't end with her passing, not at all. It ends with just the generations who were influenced by her. And her particulars are in the books. Of course, they're fiction. You know, it's embellished but they're great books. Questions and answers, we'll take that now. And there's where you can find it. And you can also find it at Trident, because Trident has ordered the book as well. And it's an audiobook now. Between the Cracks is audio. So if you're interested in that, iTunes and Audible, Amazon. Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Carmela. I do have a couple of questions for you.
Oh, awesome.
We always have people asking, and we did today too, about your writing process. Every author talk, people want to know, what was the process that went into writing a work or all of your works? If you want to speak to that for a minute,
Sure.
that would be really great. Thank you.
Every single book is different, and it's going to have different demands. So my writing process with the first book was really different. I was in my 30s when I started it, and I started it in grad school. So I had a very different view of it. And I found with that book, I just couldn't be at home. I had to find different places to write. And that's important. I think people would feel propelled to go out and write. You should do it. Or some books demand that you be at home and you write them. So the first book, I started it hand. I wrote it in hand. This is 1980s, right? You didn't drag your typewriter with you. You didn't do that. So yeah, and then it went through several drafts, and I just put it away because I didn't get a publisher. And then when I took it out, I rewrote the whole thing. I deleted passages, I added passages. And so the process of that book was, gosh, 15 years. 15
Wow,
years.
that's quite a journey for your book. And maybe it's kind of an adjacent question to that is, you didn't find a publisher in the 80s, but in the new century you did. So maybe speak to that process. Once you pulled the manuscript out again, rewrote it for the 21st century, then what happened?
Then I had a friend who had published 3 books with this particular publisher. And I said, well, can I send the book to her? And the writer emailed the publisher and said, will you look at it? And she said she would. Then I rewrote it. That was very fast. And then I still had to edit it. You know, you should always have a professional editor do that. Oh, you froze up. There you are, Kristen.
Sorry, unstable internet connection.
Always.
So let's see. So continuing on the theme of writing, again, we always get a lot of these kinds of questions. People are we have a lot of writers who come to these and who want to always hear about the process.
You have to adapt to the book. You have to adapt to the book.
So the book sort of writes you rather than you writing the book.
That's right. And it will show you its demands, especially where, for me, my space is wherever I am writing it is important. I don't mind things happening around me when I'm writing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mind that. Some people do. They need that complete quiet. But I always like kind of input, dead noise, ambient sounds. And I suggest that people utilize hotel lobbies.
Oh.
That's wasted space. There's nobody there.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody there, you know, and then there's people just kind of around, which is nice.
Background.
Yeah.
What are you writing now? You mentioned, we know that you're writing you're writing the 3rd story, and are you considering it a trilogy or?
Yes, I'm considering it a trilogy. Yeah, absolutely. Taking Angela through the 60s and the 70s and some of the 80s. Yeah. So her influence, she kept influencing right up until she passed away. You know, and we'll see the characters as they develop, you know, around her. And she comes to some realizations too at the end about her life too. So yeah. And there's the covers of it. My designer did a great job. You should definitely get a designer too.
It looks great, and it's sort of a nice unfolding over the years that you're sharing of the
Right.
family story.
Right.
So switching gears just a little bit, what's the best writing advice you've ever been given and the worst writing advice you've ever been given?
Oh, I think the worst is show, don't tell. Everybody says that. I think at times you just have to tell. I would not pay too much attention to that. Write about what you know. You don't have to write about what you know. I mean, I don't know anything about earthquakes, or the aftermath of what happened to people. You can always do some research, and if you're writing fiction, well, you can just kind of write it. But it's always good, to just do some research around. I did research around that and what happened to survivors, and so yeah, you can write about what you don't know. Absolutely. And good writing advice is kill your darlings. You can delete. You have to delete. Get rid of stuff. I learned that with my first novel, Between the Cracks. You have to get rid of stuff, and you might save what you're getting rid of because that might end up in your next book. So you don't know. And with computers now, we can just make a file and put it away and just save it. So you're not throwing everything away.
That's a really good idea for aspiring.
Yeah, don't throw it away. Feel you're not losing anything. And you shouldn't be afraid of dry days, And I did receive advice that you should write 4 pages a day. I think that's good advice.
Is that what you do? Do you write?
Yes, sometimes. Yes, I did do a lot of that for the Ascent. Now, this third book is different. It's different. I don't need to do 4 pages a day. I might do 10 pages one day, but it's just a different energy. It doesn't require that. And we shouldn't be afraid of just dry days where you didn't really write, So you just have to really trust your own rhythm and trust the book too, as you're writing it.
Those are great words of advice. Trust your own rhythm and trust the words of the book.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think we have maybe one more question.
Okay.
What are you reading now?
I'm reading Middlemarch. It's funny. Eliot. Have you read it? Have you read Middlemarch?
No.
Oh,
No.
It's an awesome book. And in the when I was an undergrad, I read it. Changed my life. It was just so awesome. This is early 19th century British. And then I reread it and I'm like, oh, what? Silly Dorothea. I mean, what's happening here? But it's a wonderful book. And it really teaches you about the omniscient narrator, because she comes in at the weirdest times to say, well, look at Dorothy, such and such. And I'm like, where'd you come from? I mean, she just kind of comes in. And in today's writing world, people would probably criticize that.
Yeah.
Because you're surprised she's coming in, but it really is a great technique. But yeah, I think it's really worth a read. Mary Wollstonecraft, Frankenstein, that is a great read. That is a great read, especially if you're interested in mysticism. So I've been reading that, and Outlander, the Outlander series. If people are interested in doing a series, she's just a force of nature, Galbadon, So those are really what I'm focusing on now. But reading something that you read in your 20s in college is a great idea, because you'll have a completely different view of it.
Right. Revisiting it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Any last thoughts sort of on writing in the pandemic or reading in the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that people should take out a notepad and pen, and if you feel moved to go to a different space, because you can go outside in coffee shops now, so you can do that. If you bring your computer, the sun's glare, that's always an issue. So then go inside someplace. But it's a great time to settle in to read and write. during the pandemic, you know. It's really, I didn't mind staying at home at all, but probably most writers don't,
Yeah.
you know. So yeah, and doing an audiobook is a great idea. I had a narrator do it, but it's really fun too, because it's some people prefer that. They prefer audiobooks while they're cleaning or knitting. So, you know, you can listen and get your chores done.
That's great. So the books are available in different formats.
Yes, ebooks, paperback, and audio.
Great.
So all three forms. And if you want the paperback, you can just go up to Trident or just Amazon, Goodreads.
Excellent.
All your usual. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing Angela's story and your story. And what we have coming up next week is chair yoga at this time. So thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Carmela Cattuti.
Thank you very much. And if anybody has questions, you have my email there, so you can just email me.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.